Ladies and gentlemen, hello once more. Welcome back. It's another episode of Professor Drew's Lab. I am recording this one right after the last one. So if you missed the last one, you missed the explanation. You boys in a new semi-office space. We're still getting it set up here, but I wanted to start tackling some of these because you guys still had a ton of questions that I couldn't have crammed into the last video without making it like an hour and a half long. So we're just gonna jump right back in. You've got a bunch more, let's do it. Bookworm 13X. There are a couple of Pokemon like Larvesta, Magikarp, Phoebus, etc. that only evolve once and or pretty late, but then turn into powerhouses. Could you share some of your design philosophy regarding such Pokemon? You are too kind to me, sir, calling it a design philosophy, but absolutely we can talk about it. So, we talked a little bit in the last one about milestones and how that kind of squeezes the requirements for an evolution. However, prime example of how I would handle something like this is from session 1, right out of the gate, Mortar. So Magby into Magmar, right? Magby also had an in-game reason, being a Woods family original. He is much stronger. His stats are much higher than all of the other players. Now you might say, well, that's unfair. And to that I say, well, I mean, it is kind of in his backstory. It's sort of a way that we would do it. So if you have a Pokemon that evolves only one time, I typically will do that. I will have them start off much stronger than anything else at that area, that level, that time in the game, and have them kind of plateau really early. So they're going to start off way ahead, and they might get 2 to 3 steps further ahead, but then they're going to stop. And until they hit those milestones, they're really just going to kind of grind down and not really see any big stat jumps. But I would encourage the players to kind of use that almost frustration with not being able to push through that stat ceiling and kind of get some new abilities. I would encourage them to use that as motivation. Maybe have... I'm going to use Mortar as an example. Obviously, this isn't representative of anything. But I would have Mortar being frustrated that he couldn't be stronger in that Magby form. And use that, really, have him challenge some tougher opponents. That could be a good milestone. Maybe have him getting frustrated and being a bit more aggressive in a fight, or maybe kind of shutting himself off in a sort of RP context. Maybe he's frustrated, he's within himself. Again, this is just an example. Obviously, Mortar didn't play out like this, or I wouldn't be talking about it like this. But that's sort of how I would do it in a typical context like that. Now, for something like a Larvesta, or a Phoebus, or a Magikarp, those milestones would be vastly different, right? So for Phoebus, obviously in the games, you're looking to raise the beauty stat or some other arbitrary thing. I would talk with the player and say okay, what are you looking for in this Phoebus? What kind of an arc would you like to see? Especially if it was their starter. If it's their starter Pokemon, absolutely. If you start with a Larvitar and you're okay, I want a Tyranitar. I'll be okay, I'll see you in session, 160 when that finally happens, because your stats are just going to go through the roof. The alternative to this is if you've got a Pokemon that only evolves once, I might even allow them to evolve around the same time as everybody else, but just squish their stats and give them a much higher staircase after they've evolved. Because Larvesta's moveset is kind of limited, but Volcarona's is wide open. So they might have a Larvesta for 40, 50, 60 sessions, whatever it takes for them to hit a point where it makes sense. Find them a good moment. Obviously, if you're using XP, a lot of this advice isn't super helpful, so I apologize for that. But they might hit a Volcarona earlier than you would expect. In the games, I think it's some crazy high level. It's 50 or something ridiculous, where you're stuck with this little Nerf football for a while, and then eventually it turns into a nuclear warhead. So I would just sort of work with the player and say okay, this is kind of what we're looking at. These are the things I would want to see from you. And then really just cut them loose. Have that Larvesta start out stronger than it should be so that it can keep up while it gets outpaced, if that makes any sense. Other Pokemon might grow faster. A lot of the times I would have a grass or a bug type sort of accelerate early and plateau real hard. Because you've got like Caterpie, Metapod, Butterfree. Again, bizarre examples, but they're not necessarily the strongest Pokemon, but you can get access to them early. But around the time of like the 3rd or 4th gym badge, they're probably getting outpaced by the things you're running into. So that's kind of how I would handle these guys as well. I would either do Larvesta into Volcarona super early, but the Volcarona kind of is bad, and then it has room to grow, but then they can get to that moment. Or the alternative is have it be a Sisyphean task. You're pushing this Larvesta with you over and over again, constantly, and finally you crack through, you get that Volcarona, and it seems much more impactful, you know? So hopefully that kind of makes sense. That's a couple different ways to do it. Typically, I would handle that last option, though. I would have it be a slog to get there. And then when they finally do have that great moment, it just means so much more, you know? So that's that on that. Mogu, you've got a couple questions for me. How do you handle the confusion status? So this one is kind of an easy one to answer. I looked at the 5th edition rules for a confused creature and just took out the ones that don't make sense. And that leaves me with a 50-50 die roll. I don't love it. I'm still working on the balance for it, but basically, if something is confused, they roll any of their dice. If they roll an even, they take a turn. If they roll an odds, they skip it, but if they were planning to do something harmful, they usually will deal some amount of damage to themselves. Which leads to some very silly moments, but hey, it's the game's changing constantly. But that is how I handle confusion. It is just a 50-50 die roll. Not super happy with it, but it does work at least for now. It doesn't come up that often, so it's okay. Moving on, also you mentioned that you haven't tested certain things when doing the Pokemon building section. What is your process for testing? Just throw it in a session and see how it plays, or is there a way you do it on your own outside of the actual game? So a lot of the untested things that I've mentioned are for sort of future prospects in a way. I went back and redesigned the entire decks. Everything that I had done, everything I hadn't done yet and hadn't gotten around to. In our little hiatus, I sat down and I remade everything. I remade abilities, I remade attacks, I remade all the species, it's fine. Took a long time, but basically what that means is rather than completely untethered, unrelated nonsense of the early game TOTS, which, trust me, rest assured, it will not be changing for the rest of the TOTS game. It's not going anywhere. A lot of the stuff that I'm using for these examples when we design stuff at the end of the lab videos is just stuff that's been designed in a vacuum again. It needs to be tested. All of the newer designs are balanced against each other and are usually meant as a first level version of that thing. So obviously if you start with, let's go back to the last example, you start with a Larvesta. Every Larvesta at first level will be the same, but by the time they hit second level, they'll be completely different. So that's sort of the design mentality for that stuff. So when I say stuff is untested, I mean this isn't the kind of thing I would put in the TOTS campaign. We did that for the first run of lab videos, but definitely moving forward, it's a good challenge for me to look at the new designs and while I'm talking about them, see what makes sense and see what doesn't. So the sort of untested aspect of these things is really just the power level's so different where the TOTS is kind of unhinged. A lot of the newer designs are much more balanced because I've learned a lot. We've done, well over 140 or I don't even know how many individual episodes counting gyms and stuff. But basically we've done 100 episodes. I've learned a ton. I've learned what works, I've learned what doesn't work, I've learned what I wish could work, I've come up with some new tricks in the toolbox. So a lot of the stuff I haven't had a chance to test, and I might find a way to sneak it into the current game, but who knows. But really it was just a fun way to challenge myself while we weren't recording main sessions. It was just go back and work on everything, and it's a good avenue to talk about it with you guys here in these lab videos. So the last question, in a previous video you mentioned that it is hard to increase stats such as strength or dexterity without a good deal of training. with the AC stat being linked to the Dex stat, giving a lot of Pokemon low ACs in the early stages, and to my knowledge, no ways to increase that in the way of armor like in traditional D&D. How do player Pokemon increase the AC stat in your game? Do you manually tick it up on level up? Do you have an ABI system at a certain level? That's ability score increase for the uninitiated. Or does it only increase upon evolution or hard work, increasing the Dex stat? So we talked about it a little bit in the last one, but without a traditional level up and scaling system, it is really difficult to buff up their stats. Now I do a lot of micromanaging of the teams to make sure everything's functioning normally and that everybody is keeping up with everybody else. So as we've seen in a lot of the session 100 bits, I'm not going to mention anything specific, but most of the teams have seen a substantial update or improvement to the way that they were functioning. And even the ones that we don't see specifically in those sessions, all of them got kind of tuned up. So without doing a standard level up method where the tots really don't have control over how they're updating their teams, I've started to hand the reins off to them. And whenever we need to, when it really feels like someone's underperforming, you get those teammates that don't always see the light of day. I'm not going to call anybody out specifically for spoiler stuff, but sometimes you have a Pokemon that did hit that plateau super early and is now completely outclassed by everything. And we need to sort of scale them up so that you can use those team members. Because my goal is not to say, well, you messed up, you didn't use this team member, and now, gosh darn it, you never will. I want to see the players using the Pokemon on their teams that they have fun using. So when I see them not using certain team members, that tells me that there's something not fun inherent in that design. So we sit down and we talk about it and we change it and we tweak it. A lot of that is, well, their AC is really low. They don't have a lot of hit points. That's the easiest thing in the world to fix. They do a little bit of training. We buff their AC by 1 or 2. We might buff a couple of their stats up if it seems like they should be better at something than they are. A lot of their attack bonuses kind of just get fluffed up to the middle. I talked in the last episode of the lab videos, trying to keep their stats between like 12 and 16 AC with a few exceptions. Hit points are all over the board, so we're not going to talk about those. And the bonuses to hit usually being between 4 and 7, because it's not really fun if you're going to roll an attack and arbitrary example, let's say, you know, our Magby mortar has like a +6 to hit and you're starting out and your Murkrow's got like a +3. You are much less likely to hit something if it is scaled towards that Magby. Because if I balanced every encounter around the toughest thing on everybody's team, everybody would die every time. So that's not really as fun. So a lot of the way that I'll do these sort of tweaks and management is to make sure that everybody can have fun with whatever team they want to bring out. That doesn't mean there won't be stakes in a combat. Absolutely, you could still get knocked out in one shot by some crazy errant hit. But my goal is never to, like, oh, I didn't even have to crit and you're completely unconscious, your whole team's out, sorry. You just sit in the corner while your friends get to play the game. So that's kind of how I run combat. I do keep a lot of that tweaking off camera, away from the sessions, because I don't want it to bog things down, and I really want to keep things focused on story and story elements and the things that the players are doing. It doesn't so much matter what my mechanics are in a session while we're playing if they have to change, if I've talked about it with the player that had the mechanic that's changing. So I've talked a few times about sort of keeping the players safe from sort of backseat gaming. A lot of that will sort of stem from these things. If everybody knows how everything's working all of the time, I don't want the comments on the videos to be so focused on this player did this thing wrong because we've seen their ability and it should function this way. It's still going to happen. Obviously, people pay attention. They can figure things out. They'll get it going. But a lot of those tweaks and stuff I do just keep off camera, mostly to just not slow things down, because that's not as exciting for people who are watching the main sessions for the story. I don't want to bog them down with mechanics. So we do end up cutting a lot of that stuff, but that's what these videos are for, so I can talk to you guys because I know you'll be interested in it. But moving on from Mogu, we have NWR Tank Engine back again. Thanks for answering my questions from the last Q&A. Absolutely, my friend, anytime. Since the Pokemon were regular animals and stuff that evolved with the Source Stones, how did the Machop line come to be? Were they originally people that evolved from the fighting type, Source Stone? So I like to imagine the Machop line, and this could be completely wrong, but this is just kind of how I see them. I see them as a more traditional 5th edition like clay golem. That's sort of the vibe I get from the design. They seem very useful and powerful and helpful little dudes that enjoy helping people. And, you know, I kind of just see them as like a little golem that had some life breathed into them. So that's kind of where that's at. That's how I see it. Blue Creeper, we stan Wimpimble. Just kidding. I know your actual question is, how would you run Ultra Beasts in your setting? The short and savage answer is I wouldn't, but that's not helpful, so let's talk about it. Obviously, they would have to be immensely powerful creatures. They're ridiculously busted in the games. Their stats are through the roof. So I would have them be maybe a lab experiment gone wrong. You could lean the other direction and say that they are literal aliens. You could do a sort of planescape game where dimensional portals are ripping open and these things are coming through, like, and the players have to kind of jump through the portals after them and fight to get everything closed and put everything back where it's meant to be. That does open a realm for an adventure where you're literally doing like plane hopping, which could be kind of fun. If your game is built around that and your campaign world is kind of balanced around everybody having the ability to jump from one plane to another, that could make for an awesome set of antagonists, is to have all of these ridiculously busted aliens just ripping their way through the world, and you've got to kind of go out and fight them. So that could make for a really fun, like, high-level adventure. So that's where my brain goes. I don't like them. We don't have to get into that right now. I do that a lot when in the days of the Twitch streaming. I am not a fan of the Ultra Beasts. I don't like a lot of mythics and the legends, so I do avoid them. Now let me immediately be hypocritical, and we're going to jump down to BT Mikey for our last question of this video. I'd love to see you design a boss encounter, like with a legendary. Obviously, I prefer Manafee, but any big boss Pokemon would be a lot of fun. Okay, so let's throw everything I just said in that last question out the window, and let's tackle 2 builds all at once with a ridiculous encounter. Let's do a high-level legendary encounter. Let's throw a Suicune in with a Manafee, because I was looking at like water-type legendary synergies, and I sort of landed on this, and I wanted to include a Manafee, but Manafee's going to need a little bit of help with the way I have it designed, so let's talk about it. Obviously, Suicune traditionally is a like defensive powerhouse, a lot of stalling and recovery tactics. I did not go that route because that's not as fun in like a D&D encounter. And Manafee's got just a lovely toolkit of recovery moves, and both of these creatures love rain. They love rain and rain effects. So we're going to tackle Suicune first, because Manafee is really our sort of highlight for this. So we're just going to talk about Suicune, who's going to be doing a lot of the kind of takedowns, a lot of the damage for this encounter. So we want Suicune, first things first, we want it in the rain. The arena, I'm going to leave kind of ambivalent here. The first thing that comes to mind is like maybe like a rain slick precipice over like a big cliff drop, kind of like the cliffs of Dover or somewhere. That could be a really fun place to have this encounter. You'd have Suicune out there, rain and thunderstorm going all around. That rain's gonna obviously increase the damage output and really shut down anybody that's using fire. It does also open it up if your players have some like lightning, electric damage and effects. Depending on how you run those things, I let rain buff lightning exactly like it does in the games, because I think that's kind of cool. The moveset I gave for Suicune is Extreme Speed, Ice Fang, Roar, and Sheer Cold. So let's talk about the moves first, then we'll get into abilities and sort of what our battle plan is. So for Extreme Speed, I would tack that on. If I was using legendary actions, I would probably put Extreme Speed on as a legendary action, maybe for 2, or maybe it gets like 1 a round and it can do this once per round, depending on the level. But anyways, all that to say, legendary action if you're doing that. Very high bonus to hit, solid damage, probably around 3d6. I would scale that up or down depending on the level of the encounter. High bonus to hit being like 10 to 15. If I've learned anything from the 1 to 2 big combatants against an entire team, action economy is important, so you want to make sure that your big guy is hitting every single time and potentially knocking someone out every single time they hit. Because depending on the power scaling of your game, you might be dealing with 60 plus combatants, and that can get out of hand really quick. So you want to make sure that when your guy does get to do the thing, it hurts. So that's our extreme speed. It also keeps Suicune mobile, because you can move up to your movement speed when you use extreme speed. So I would give this thing probably 60 feet of movement, maybe 120 feet in rain, if you want to get real nuts with it. That way Suicune can really just not get pinned down. That's sort of a thing we're looking for. You may or may not give it legendary resistances, and typically restrained is a bad one to have locked onto your giant legendary creature. But that's extreme speed. Ice Fang does great damage, pretty solid chance to do frostbite or freeze the target. I would do probably like 3d8, something like that, and do a similar callback to the if you critically hit or roll maximum damage effect. I would have them get frostbitten if you do that route, otherwise they're just flat out frozen. But I'll warn you, when we get down to sheer cold, you probably want to start with frostbite. So obviously it's going to do a fair bit of damage, but let's talk about sheer cold, because sheer cold really cares about a creature being frozen. So any effect I have that would give you frostbite, if you get hit again, you are frozen. I use both effects rather than just frostbite is bad and frozen is insane. Now you sort of have to get them frostbitten twice. So it's not a save or die thing, it is a save twice or die thing. So there's a little bit of a buffer zone. Sheer cold, tons of damage, like 8d8, something stupid, just ridiculous. I would probably lock this to a certain amount of times per day, or put it on a recharge of like a 5 or a 6. Kind of like a breath weapon, because that's basically what this is. But it's also not great for the team synergy, so I might limit this to in case Manafee goes down, and we'll talk about what Manafee does in a bit. So when you hit with sheer cold, I turn that rain into a blizzard. So it slows down the combatants, it's going to cut their visibility down, their ranged attacks are going to be a lot less. If your target is frozen, we skip damage, we go straight to unconscious. I would stabilize them because, again, they're going to be frozen solid in a block and the trainer probably can't get to them. But I would have them stabilized, but it would definitely kind of put everybody on a clock if their team starts turning into popsicles, like right in front of them. So that's not super great. But definitely that attack should be on probably a recharge, if not a set amount of uses per day, maybe 3. But again, depends on how deadly you want the encounter to be. Last but not least, in our toolbox, we have Roar, a very simple trick to stun potentially all of your enemy combatants right on our first turn. We like our tougher encounters to start with a bang, so potentially stunning everybody is a great way to get everybody afraid of you, and also potentially start landing some critical Ice Fangs and get those frostbite and or frozen stacks going on everybody. The abilities are pretty basic. I would probably slap pressure on this thing. I use pressure as an aura that negates advantage for your enemies. It prevents them from gaining additional bonuses to hit or stacking, flanking bonuses, anything like that. Prevents all of those deals. It mitigates the effects of these sort of big creature, many smaller creatures, you die to action economy. If they're less likely to hit you, you're more likely to stay up and keep going. Now, if that fails, let's jump down to the star of our show. We've got Manafee. So, longtime viewers who are sort of caught up, I'm not going to say specifics, but you guys know that in my multi-battles, I love having 1 or 2 big bruisers and then something innocuous in the back that's just sort of chilling, but also healing everybody back up and making everything a bigger problem than it should be. So for Manafee, we've got Hydration, which means that until that blizzard kicks in, or maybe if it doesn't, Manafee is recovering any status that it has at the start of the turn. So if they manage to paralyze you or stun you, or you're incapacitated but you're not at 0 hit points, you're getting right back up at the start of your turn. You're gonna take your action pretty much no matter what, as long as it's raining. So we've got Water Pulse as a strong ranged attack to keep the pressure on and protect our pal Suicune, and potentially confuse and lock down our opponents. We've got Tail Glow in case Suicune does go down. It's going to give us a massive bonus to our attack rolls, our damage rolls, our saving throws, and our armor class. This is mostly for if Suicune falls, but you could definitely just do this right away if you want to be nasty about it. It's a good chance for Manafee to get revenge if Suicune does, drop unconscious, or it might let you hold out long enough to just get away, live to fight another day, depending on how you're handling your legendaries. We've got Aqua Ring. It's going to give us an immunity to fire damage. Not the most useful thing when we're already resistant and we're probably in rain or heavy rain, but more important than any of that, it's going to give us some HP regen. So we're going to be able to pretty much stay online the entire fight. And then last but not least, we have a Rain Dance. So if our enemies somehow does manage to change the weather, if they bring an Entei and it does its version of sunny day and it would shut down any other weather effects, then it's just whichever one. I treat it like Magic. Whichever one goes on the stack later is going to override the first one. So we have a Rain Dance on Manafee. If Suicune goes down and that torrential rain stops, you can at least turn it back on for yourself. I don't require my legendaries to maintain concentration on their weather effects. Your mileage may vary with that. These stats for both of these guys really aren't worth mentioning. For the system that I use for the legendaries, they all have 20s to 30s in every stat, meaning they're almost certainly going to hit you with whatever they're doing, and they're almost certainly going to save from any effect you use on them. But again, I use them kind of like a sort of toolpath system. They are a conjured idea of what an element should be, so that might not work for an encounter like this. So I might balance it a little bit better, put them in like mid-20s for a couple of their abilities, and maybe put something down in like the high teens so that they have a chance to fail something. Unless you're not doing legendary resistances, in which case do whatever you want. If the encounter is meant to be deadly, I would put the AC pretty high. Otherwise, I would have it to be decided by the power levels of the player characters and their teammates and stuff like that. But I might put a few extra limitations on the abilities. Maybe lower some of the saving throw DCs, but let them do things like Sheer Cold an infinite number of times. I would just put a saving throw attached to it. But otherwise, I would just sort of untether them. So that is sort of how I would handle like a legendary encounter with a Suicune and a Manafee. These are two creatures I feel safe to say we'll probably never actually see like in combat in the TOTS game. So I got no problem kind of laying out how I would run them right here, right now for you guys. But that is all the time we have for this episode. So as always, I hope you guys did enjoy. If you have more questions, or if you have some clarifiers on any of the ones that we've handled here so far, feel free to drop them in the comment section below on this or any of the videos on the channel. I will say, going forward, I touched on it a bit in the last one, but I recorded that about 20 minutes ago. So obviously it hasn't really had time to simmer, so I'm just going to say it again. If you guys have any questions on some of the more recent sessions, feel free to drop those on here. I will probably do some spoiler-ish answers to some of those in the weeks going forward. I might try to compile them. Maybe we'll do a slightly longer session that I can just tell people, hey, if you're not cut up, you can skip this one. But that way you guys can ask your questions. I know there's a lot of questions specifically on 97, and I'm not going to say specifics right now because we're not in that video yet. But we'll probably tackle a couple unrelated non-lab questions in those videos and just kind of talk about, again, in encounter design, why certain things play out the way they do, and what things sort of look like moving forward. But I've rambled on plenty long enough. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching. I will catch you in the next one. Bye-bye!